Our first two speakers today are Melissa Barker and Stu Wilson. Melissa Barker holds a PhD in sociology and master's degrees in both sociology and labor relations from the University of Oregon. She is taught not only at the University of Oregon, but also Michigan State University and the State University of New York, Potsdam. Additionally, Melissa Barker has worked as a lead researcher and clinical data analyst for Hennepin County Human Services and the Public Health Department of Minneapolis. Her co-speaker, Stu Wilson, holds a Master of Art History degree from the University of Oregon, along with 2 bachelor's degrees in history and art history from the University of Wisconsin. He's worked in several roles, including the Teachers Union, statewide literacy campaigns, and multiple museums. In the last 25 years, Mr. Wilson has devoted himself to public libraries, serving as a National Library consultant. In this role, Wilson has assisted over 200 libraries across the U.S. and worldwide, while continuing to publish and present throughout the library services field. Please welcome Stu Wilson with their talk, Copper Baron and Cattle King, Michael Donahoe's Hidden Legacy.
Thank you for being here. Thanks to Cassidy and the Historical Society for hosting the conference. It's been a wonderful conference. Today we hope to provide you an overview of the little-known but significant contributions of Michael Donahoe and his family to the growth and development of Montana. Now, I drew the short straw to be the one talking to you today. Mel's going to be advancing the slides, but it really has been co-research. So if you have any questions afterwards, please ask Mel. So this project is an offshoot of our research on F. Scott Fitzgerald's visit to Montana in 1915, which was highlighted in a recent article in the Historical Society's Montana magazine of Western History. Fitzgerald's stay with the Donahoe family led directly into his creation of one of his best short stories, The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, which is set in Montana. We won't go into much of that history, but suffice it to say that in this centennial year of the publication of The Great Gatsby, one of the fundamental experiences which led to the writing of that great American masterpiece was Fitzgerald's visit to Montana to spend the summer with his best college and high school friend Charles Donahoe, the son of Michael Donahoe. I'm sure many of you will appreciate this as researchers. Trying to find out more about Charles Donahoe's family led us to his father, but along the way we encountered numerous unexpected research challenges. Michael Donahoe was the right-hand man of Copper King Marcus Daly, so many of his activities fell under or were attributed to Marcus Daly. This was Donahoe's role at the Anaconda and was entirely appropriate, but it makes it difficult to really understand the activities and influence of Donahoe himself. Second, Donahoe never really sought the limelight, even after he was no longer under Daly's influence. So the references to him in the historical record are often hidden and hard to find. Finally, when Michael Donahoe was active in Butte and Anaconda, there were at least 3 other Michael Donahoes in this Irish bastion, so it's hard to figure out which one it was him. And his last name, as you can see on the screen, went through multiple evolutions and variations before settling on Donahoe. But most annoyingly, it took us almost 2 years to figure out that he almost never went by Michael. He almost always went by M. Donahoe, which is really challenging if you're trying to do digital research on him. Once we discovered that, a major trove of historical records opened up to us. More documentation appeared when we made contact with Anne Donahoe, his great-granddaughter, and we want to take a moment to thank Anne and her family for making so many materials available to us, including most of the photographs that are in this presentation. Michael Donahoe. So who was this guy? He was the son of Irish immigrants born in Cortland, New York in 1861. We aren't quite sure when he came west, but it was probably in the early 1880s to the silver fields, silver mines in Nevada. But in any case, he came to Montana in 1886 to become the combined regional agent for the Northern Pacific, Union Pacific, and Montana Union Railroads, a pretty prominent and important position. Soon, the talented young Irishman caught the eye of fellow countryman Marcus Daly, just as Daly was looking for solutions for transporting copper ore between Anaconda and Butte. In 1889, the Copper King hired Donahoe to become his head of transportation. Here you see the telegram from Daly to Donahoe offering him the job. Donahoe's initial title was traffic manager. Daly's Anaconda Copper Company was growing by leaps and bounds, and transportation was one of the company's major problems. It needed to not only transport copper ore to nearby smelters in Montana, the railway also had to transport many other essentials for copper production, notably coal, timber, and new equipment. Donahoe's job for Daly was a big one. By the late 1880s, Marcus Daly was increasingly frustrated with the high fees railroads were charging to move his copper ore, particularly the Montana Union Railroad, and began seriously exploring the possibility of creating his own railroad between Butte and Anaconda, and then perhaps even extending that railroad line to the Pacific. Daly entered negotiations with James J. Hill and the Great Northern Railway, which had reached Butte by 1891, to help him build his new rail line. Michael Donahoe made numerous trips back to St. Paul, where Hill was headquartered, and it appears that he was the central conduit in these dealings between Hill and Daly. Finally, with the Great Northern's help, Daly's new 22-mile-long line, the Butte, Anaconda, and Pacific Railway, or the BANP as it's often known, was built quickly and opened in 1893. Donahoe's job clearly involved overseeing the details of building the line. If any of you are railroad buffs, the details of building the BANP are extensively documented in the Great Northern's records at the Minnesota Historical Society. The BANP carried copper ore, refined copper, other materials back and forth between Butte and Anaconda, but also linked the two cities with 8 passenger trains a day. Michael Donahoe was named the superintendent of the new line and put in charge of its operations. He led the new railroad for the first 8 years of its existence. Here we see a recent picture of the BANP administration building in Anaconda. The building is now being considered for use as a county archive. Donahoe probably oversaw the building's construction and also had an office here. On the right, you see an ad for the BANP from the Anaconda City Directory from the late 1890s. The centerpiece of Michael Donahoe's work for Marcus Daly in Anaconda was rooted in the BANP and transportation, but his rise in the company increasingly extended well beyond railroads. His title with the BANP changed regularly until he became the vice president of the railroad. But by 1892, Daly had made him a partner and a stockholder in the Ana Company itself, and Donahoe even chaired the stockholder meeting in that year. By 1896, in addition to his overseeing the BANP, Donahoe's position in the Anaconda had risen even further, and he was sometimes referred to as the VP of the Anaconda, and at other times as Marcus Daly's private secretary. In any case, Donahoe was Daly's close and trusted confidant. He wasn't a copper king, but it isn't a misnomer to call him a copper baron. Perhaps the best indication of this is the following contemporary account of the role Donahoe played for Daly, especially in his various political battles. Here's a short newspaper account from 1910. It was among Donahoe's duties to try out and report on men whom Daly wished to do business with, especially politicians. For instance, the man who sought Daly's favor for Congress would, when it became convenient, be invited to take a trip over the railroad in Donahoe's private car. And when the trip was concluded, Donahoe's report would result in the doing or undoing of the aforesaid politician. Another sure sign of Michael Donahoe's ascendancy in the Anaconda and Marcus Daly's desire to have him succeed him was Donahoe's involvement in Daly's finances and banks. As Marcus Daly's health was failing and he was looking to retire to Hamilton, Daly made Michael Donahoe a partner in his banks in both Butte and Anaconda in 1898. This was done with the approval of Daly's lead California investor, James Ben Ali Hagen. Indeed, Donahoe took over supervision of both banks and even renovated the Anaconda Bank with an office for himself. Here you see an early ad where Hagen is still listed as a director. This bank then became the Daly, Donahoe, and Greenwood Bank, and the building still exists as the First Montana branch in Anaconda today. Daly's bank in Butte became the Daly, Donahoe, and Moyer Bank. Thus, Donahoe was being positioned by Daly to take on the reins of the whole Anaconda Company with Daly's impending retirement. But the Anaconda's fortunes changed dramatically in 1899, and Daly died in 1900. And with these developments, Donahoe's futures changed dramatically as well. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But first, we want to shift gears for a bit and talk about Michael Donahoe's family, his wife Anna and their 4 children, and their life in Anaconda, which extended then to White Sulphur Springs. Michael Donahoe married Anna Malloy in 1892. Anna was from Shullsburg, Wisconsin, not too far from Galena, Illinois. Like Butte and Anaconda, this was a rich mining region known for its deposits of lead and zinc, and Montana was heavily populated, and like Montana, it was heavily populated by Irish immigrants. So there were multiple connections between this area along the Mississippi and Butte and Anaconda. Here are pictures of the Catholic Church in Shullsburg, Wisconsin, where Anna and Michael were married. Anna's father ran a hardware and mercantile store located where the cheese shop is on the screen. It is Wisconsin, after all. Also pictured is the large convent of the Dominican sisters located right near Shullsburg at a place called Sinsinawa Mound. At one point, over 200 nuns resided here. The sisters ran a very large and rigorous high school academy for girls of all faiths from up and down the Mississippi. Anna received an extensive and comprehensive education from the Dominicans and became a high school teacher in her hometown. But the Dominicans at this time were sending teachers out on missions to other mining communities across the United States, which led Anna to move to Anaconda to teach Irish and other immigrant children whose parents were working at the copper smelter. Incidentally, the Dominicans retain a presence in Anaconda today, running a short-term shelter for at-risk youth and the Dominican Development Center in town. By all reports, Anna was a beloved teacher who also started the first book club in town and offered piano and voice lessons. Michael and Anna fell in love, married back in Wisconsin, and after a honeymoon in Chicago, settled into family life in Anaconda. Anna and Michael had their first child, Henry, in 1894, and had 3 more children, all born in Anaconda. Here's a picture of the 4 Donahoe children from around 1903. From youngest to oldest and left to right, they are Walter, Kathleen, Charles, and Henry, who usually went by Harry. The Donahoe's residence in Anaconda was at 608 Hickory Street in Anaconda. It was probably built for them around 1894, just as Harry was about to be born. It was right across the street from Marcus Daly's large residence, and it is another indication of Donahoe's close relationship to Daly. Other nearby houses were also those of Daly's relatives, including his sisters. And the neighborhood was really an enclave for Daly's closest family and supporters. As the Donahoe family grew, they added a second story to the home in 1898, as you can see in a 1903 photo on the left, and on the right is a current photo of the house. It still exists. County records indicate that the Donahoes actually owned the home until 1905, which, as you'll understand, indicates their desire to return to this house at some point. Now let us continue the story of what caused Michael Donahoe and his family to leave Montana and develop extensive connections in White Sulphur Springs as well. Their connections in Montana continued for decades, but in 1901, Michael Donahoe's copper career was shattered and his comfortable life in Anaconda came to an end. We can't revisit the full story here, but briefly, the Rockefeller family and their associates took over the Anaconda Company in 1899 and then used their control over the Anaconda to dominate the entire state of Montana for 15 years. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that story. The cartoon on the left depicts the total control of Montana exerted by the Rockefeller interests. In the cartoon on the right, you can see John D. Rockefeller sits on a throne while his henchman has stabbed both Marcus Daly and Michael Donahoe in the back, leaving them for dead on the path to the top. In this conflict, Michael Donahoe was ruthlessly ousted from the Anaconda Company, and Donahoe's family fortunes were forever changed. By the next year, the family had left Montana, and Michael Donahoe never worked again in either copper or railroading. When F. Scott Fitzgerald visited Montana in 1915, he learned about the history of his friend's family, and then that became central to the creation of his short story, The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. If you're interested in this part of the story, it was in the recently published article in Montana Magazine, and we won't go into that. Read that article. But to return to our story, the Donahoes, after their ejection from the Anaconda, the Donahoes were forced to leave Montana. Exiled, Michael and the rest of the family initially moved to San Francisco in 1901, but after the enormous earthquake in 1906, the family was forced to relocate again, this time permanently to Seattle. Here we see the Donahoes' substantial home in Seattle, which was built around 1910. It overlooked Lake Washington, not far from the University of Washington. But despite being forced to leave Anaconda and Montana, the Donahoes' interest and love of Montana continued for decades. Immediately after his ouster in 1900, Michael began investing in other Montana businesses, and he also quickly made Montana his family's summer home. One of Michael Donahoe's first investments after his expulsion from the Anaconda was the Butte Brewery. He bought the brewery in 1900 and quickly incorporated the business with himself as president. The brewery also needed new capital, and in the first few years of his ownership, Donahoe funded a number of improvements in the facilities and operations. Here are a few more shots of the brewery, both the exterior and a series of interior photos. Although the Donahoes never directly operated the brewery, that was handled by managers and brewmasters. The family retained ownership into the 1960s. It's worth noting that while there were multiple serious labor upheavals in Butte throughout this early period, the brewery was unionized and labor was strongly supported by both the management and the Donahoes. Another investment by Michael Donahoe was in partnership with D.J. Hennessy. Hennessy, of course, owned the Hennessy department store in Butte, which also served as the company store for the Anaconda. Together, they secured the rights to develop the water mains and other pipelines in the city. This was not only profitable for Donahoe, but also greatly provided the much-needed capital to build the growing city and the infrastructure for the big city. Perhaps Michael Donahoe's most diverting investment, and certainly my favorite, although the brewery's pretty up there, was in a minor league professional baseball team, the Anaconda Serpents, also sometimes called the Calciners. Calciners are workers in a smelter. Anaconda's only professional baseball team in history, the Serpents only played during the summer of 1900 in the Montana State League. Anaconda was the last team to join the league, which included the Helena Senators, the Great Falls Smoke Eaters, and the Butte Miners. Late in the spring of 1900, Donahoe financed the Serpents, and without that investment, the whole league probably never would have existed at all. The Serpents' most famous player was pitcher Dad Clarkson, who went on to a good career in the major leagues, mainly for the St. Louis Browns. There are many, many fun stories about the Anaconda Serpents and the whole league, but it was a very rough and tumble league, but that's going to have to wait for another presentation. Michael Donahoe's biggest investment in Montana, though, was in White Sulphur Springs, the Castle Mountain Ranch, which is just outside of White Sulphur Springs. He began investing in the ranch as early as 1900. By 1903, he had secured full ownership and also purchased surrounding properties, expanding its final reach to 35,000 acres, or about 12 miles by 16 miles. At the time, it was one of the largest ranches in Montana. Michael Donahoe was described locally as the cattle king of Smith River Valley. In its early years, the ranch typically ran over 4,000 sheep and 3,000 beef cattle. It employed around 20 people, making the Donahoes one of the largest employers in the White Sulphur Springs area. Until the late 1930s, the ranch was managed by a foreman. This changed in later years when Michael and Anna's sons, Charles and Walter, both built homes on the ranch in the late 1930s. Ultimately, Walter made the ranch his permanent year-round residence. Here's a later 1952 picture commissioned by the Donahoes of their ranch. It's by the accomplished Montana artist Elizabeth Lockery, who is perhaps best known for her portraits of members of the Blackfeet Nation. In the painting, you can see the Castle Mountains in the background, and on the far left, the home that Walter built on the ranch. When Michael and the Donahoe family did visit White Sulphur Springs, they stayed here at the castle. Built by Byron Sherman, a local rancher and businessman, it is the most prominent and luxurious house in town. The family vacationed here almost every summer and would typically visit the ranch, which was about 4 miles away. Most summers they spent at least 3 months here at the castle. The family first stayed here in 1904 when Michael Donahoe rented the house for the summer. By the next year, he had purchased the home for $7,000, an enormous sum at the time, and it became their summer home well into the 1930s. During their summers here, the Donahoes contributed to the social and cultural life of the community, often hosting events and making various contributions, especially to the Catholic Church. This was the house where F. Scott Fitzgerald stayed when he visited for about 5 weeks in 1915. Today, as many of you may know, the castle is a museum and the headquarters of the Meagher County Historical Society, much worth a visit if you're ever in the territory. The house was generously donated to the Historical Society by the Donahoes in the 1960s. We need to do a quick aside here. I'm sure many of you are aware of the Gordon family of White Sulphur Springs, particularly Rose and Taylor, seen on the left here. They were highlighted in 2 great recent biographies by Michael Johnson, including one published by the Montana Historical Society. The Gordons were the leading African-American family in the community, and both Rose and Taylor went on to significant accomplishments. Taylor became a singer during the Harlem Renaissance, acclaimed in both the U.S. and across Europe. Later in the 1960s, in a 1960s newspaper column, Rose, who was kind of the community historian, documented that she worked for the Donahoes for a number of summers in the early years. She took care of the children as well as making dinners for the family. She noted that both Michael and Anna were grand people. She also worked for and appreciated the youngest son, Walter, and his wife, Bobby, too. Thus, we're sure there was a strong connection between the Gordons and the Donahoes. To return to Michael Donahoe, let us summarize the significant contributions he made to Montana. First and foremost, he was a leading figure at the Anaconda Copper Company, the most important corporation probably in the state's history. He was a close confidant and protege of Copper King Marcus Daly. He headed up the development of the BA&P Railway and oversaw its first 8 years of operation. Later, he created and owned one of Montana's largest ranches, which was a major employer in the White Sulphur Springs area. He purchased and further developed the Butte Brewery. He fostered significant developments in both Butte and Anaconda in mining and smelting, railroads, city infrastructures, and real estate. I didn't really go into that. And he and his family contributed to the social, cultural, and educational life of Anaconda and White Sulphur Springs. Michael Donahoe died tragically in 1910 at the young age of 49. Anna Donahoe inherited his entire estate, and she enlisted her brother Henry Malloy to manage the estate and all of Michael's Montana businesses into the 1920s. Increasingly at that time, beginning around 1920, the Donahoe children became more and more involved in running the family's Montana businesses. They maintained joint ownership, notably of the ranch, brewery, and castle, well into the 1960s, and continued to make significant contributions to Montana. Here are pictures of the three oldest Donahoe siblings as adults. We'll get to the youngest son, Walter, in a second. On the left is Harry, who graduated from Yale and then served as a lieutenant in the Quartermaster Corps in the Army during World War I. Very tragically, only 8 days after his discharge from the Army in 1919, he died in New York City in a hotel just after telegramming his mother that he was on his way home to Seattle. He was a victim of the big Spanish flu epidemic sweeping across the world that year. Harry reportedly loved Montana, but never really got to experience the ranch and castle as an adult. In the middle of the screen is Charles, F. Scott Fitzgerald's best friend. A graduate of Princeton, Charles later managed the family businesses outside of Montana, which were also considerable. But he built a summer home on the Castle Mountain Ranch in the late 1930s as well and made it his summer home. And on the right is daughter Kathleen, who never married. She lived in the family home in Seattle and flirted at one point with becoming a Catholic nun. But throughout the rest of her life, she remained part of the mix alongside her brothers in overseeing the family's joint business affairs. Michael Donahoe's Montana legacy, however, continued most strongly in his youngest son, Walter. Walter also graduated from Yale with a law degree and initially returned home to Seattle. But as we already mentioned, he built a home on the Castle Mountain Ranch, and he and his wife, Bobby, seen here, made it their permanent residence. He also became manager of the ranch and likely oversaw the Butte Brewery as well, making him a noteworthy businessman in Montana for nearly 30 years. But he also made significant contributions to the state, notably serving for 2 terms as Montana State Senator from Meagher County. He also served on the State Fair Board and was one of the trustees of the Foundation for Montana State University. He and his wife Bobby made numerous contributions to support various organizations and institutions in White Sulphur Springs. He left the records of the ranch and the brewery to the archives and library at Montana State, and we owe him a historical debt for making these important documents available. Bobby and Walter didn't have children, so the Donahoe's Montana businesses were ultimately sold in the 1960s, and the family's direct Montana connections came to an end. To conclude, although hidden and difficult to trace, the Donahoe family greatly contributed to the growth of Montana for over 80 years. Michael Donahoe was a major player in the economic development of many of Montana's major industries, including copper mining, railroads, ranching and agriculture, brewing, and more. And his family continued this legacy in ranching and brewing and extended the Donahoe's impact on Montana into politics, education, and social and cultural activities. Thus, Michael Donahoe and his family's lasting contributions to Montana deserve renewed and continued attention in the grand history of our state. Thanks much for taking the time to listen.